Hello, and welcome to another semester of Stage Combat class. I'm super excited to be working with you, and this is the first of the video lessons for the distance learners. Now, if you are an in-person learner, you're going to be doing all of these exercises in class, so you don't need to worry about these video assignments. However, if you're absent, or you're quarantined, or for whatever reason you miss out on participation points and you need to make up participation points, you can do so by performing some of these video lessons on the topics that you missed in class. And of course, distance learners, this is what you'll be doing instead of getting participation points in class. For each one of these video lessons, you're going to be watching me perform and explain some real basic techniques and exercises, and then you're going to practice those on your own, and then please record yourself performing those techniques and upload the videos into Canvas. Now, when you record yourself, first off, you're going to need a prop weapon, and you can check those out from me after school every day from 2:15 to 2:30. Just come on by, I'll be here with prop weapons. You can take them home, keep them for as long as you need to perform these assignments. Now, for this class, I'll be checking out these SAFD single swords. The first weapon that we're going to be learning in class is single transitional rapier. Now, a rapier looks like this, and we have several of these, but we don't have enough of these for people to check them out, and we don't even have a classroom set of these for everybody to use them during class. We have 3 of these. I also have a good friend, Zach Curtis, at Salt Lake Community College, who has a few extra that he can loan to us when it comes time for us to test. But everybody in the class is going to be learning their techniques using these SAFD single swords. And then when it comes time to test, if you're in class, you can use one of these rapiers. If you're at home, then you are welcome to do your tests with these single swords. In fact, it's a little bit of a secret, but when I did my Dueling Arts International single rapier test, I actually used a single sword. I didn't use a rapier. I don't know why my teacher, Chris Duvall, wanted me to do that, but that's what he decided. So it's perfectly acceptable to do your assessments using a single sword instead of a rapier. And these are much less expensive. I made all of these myself by purchasing a bunch of bulk competitive fencing parts and put them together for less than about $40 a piece. One of these, on the other hand, costs about $350 a piece. That's why we have so many of these. Okay, so when you record yourself, it's extremely important that, number one, you're wearing gloves. Don't ever handle one of these metal weapons without a pair of gloves, because that means the oils from your fingers will get onto the sword and corrode it and tarnish it and create rust. So please, wear the gloves. They're as much for the sword's protection as they are for yours. Number two, please make sure that I can see your entire body. I need to be able to see your whole body, including and especially your feet. So please, if you need to get somebody to hold the camera for you, or hold a mobile device or a cell phone or a tablet up and move it around as you're recording, please do that. It's super important, and if I'm not able to see your body, I am going to send those videos back to you and ask you to please refilm them. Now, also, I recommend that you do these outside, and if it's cold, even if there's a little bit of snow on the ground, dress up warmly, put on a few extra layers, wear some gloves and a hat, and please go outside where you have enough space that you can move around and do these activities and these exercises completely without having to bump into furniture or readjust yourself every few seconds. And then finally, I ask that you please do your absolute best. Take the time to practice these exercises. Film yourself and take a look at the film and compare it to the films that I'm making and posting in Canvas. And if there's a big difference, go back and give it another shot. If there are major problems, especially if there's a problem that creates a safety hazard, then I'm going to ask you to refilm these. Okay, so let's start by talking about the anatomy of our weapons. I'll start with the single sword that most of you are going to be using, and all of you are going to be using at home. Okay, so this is an SAFD single sword. SAFD stands for Society of American Fight Directors. It's one of the 2 primary stage combat organizations here in the United States. Dueling Arts International is the other one. And I actually do have my SAFD actor combatant certification, even though I am a DAI teacher. They're both wonderful organizations. Now, the SAFD, the single sword is not a historic weapon. It is an invention of Hollywood. These weapons are made by taking a practice competitive fencing epee blade and attaching it to a practice competitive fencing saber hilt. Okay, so you can literally make these out of competitive fencing parts. All right, now the handle is very simple. This is the handle or the grip. It's got a pommel right here, and then this is the bell guard, and it's got this nice swept guard that protects the knuckles. The sword blade itself is actually triangular. It's got 3 sides right here. It's got one side that has this indentation running along it, and those on epee blades are actually used to run the wire through the blade to the tip where there's a little bit of a button, so that you can press the button. It sends an electrical signal through the wire into an electrical cable that runs down the fencer's arm, through their shirt, out the back of their shirt, through another wire, all the way down into a score box that then makes a light go on when you touch that little button. So that right there, that side of the blade with the gutter in it, that is the back of the blade. It's one of the, we're going to call this one of the flat edges of the blade. And then the other side, which is where the triangular shape is pointing. So if we assume that the blade is an isosceles triangle, this would be the top of the isosceles triangle. We're going to call that the other flat side of the blade. Even though it's kind of got a point to it, we're going to call it the flat, and then this is also going to be the flat of the blade. Now, the blade itself can be divided up into 4 sections. One of those sections, in fact, the most important section, is not even visible. It's the part that goes through the handle. It's called the tang. So the blade right here connects to a smaller part of the blade, goes all the way through the handle and into the pommel. And all of our tangs are threaded tangs, which means the pommel screws onto the tang clockwise, just like a regular nut or bolt. And so the first thing that you should do when you pick up a stage combat prop, if it has a tang and a threaded pommel, is to take it by the hand and to shake it and see if there's any rattling or sound that you hear. And if there is, it probably means that the tang is loose and the pommel is loose. So you just take the pommel and you tighten the pommel until you can't hear any shaking anymore. And if you tighten it as far as it'll go and you still shake it around and feel it loose or some rattling or hear some sound, that might mean that there's a problem with the tang, and therefore the weapon is unsafe and you should not use it. Bring it back to me. I'll either give you another weapon or we'll figure out what we can do together. We might need to put it into a vise to tighten that pommel down a little bit. That's the first thing that you should do. The second thing that you should do is, using a gloved hand, just run your fingers gently along the edges of the blade and make sure that there aren't any sharp burrs sticking out that would catch and scratch the skin if you made contact on flesh. So, like if you were to gently put your sword up against your forearm and pull, you would want to make sure that it didn't break the skin. So don't actually do that. Just take your fingers, run it along, and just make sure that there aren't any burrs. And if there's significant ones, please bring the weapon back to me and we'll file those out. But unless you are hitting the blade against something else, which you should not be doing, you're not going to be creating any burrs. So we don't need to worry about that too much. Okay, so let's talk about, the other parts of the blade. So that's the tang, most important part of the blade, goes through the handle. And there are 3 other sections. Okay, so you can divide the visible part of the blade up into thirds. Now, the top third, right here, this is called the foible, F-O-I-B-L-E, foible. This is the weak part of the blade because it doesn't have a lot of leverage. However, it is also the offensive part of the blade because if I am going to swing this weapon like this, physics dictates that the tip of the blade is going to be moving the farthest distance, therefore it's going to be moving the fastest, therefore it is going to have the most force behind it. So if I want to hurt or damage something, I want to hit it with the foible of the blade. I do not want to try and hit it with this part of the blade down here at the bottom. It won't do as much damage. Now let's talk about this part of the blade. This right here is called the fort. It's spelled F-O-R-T-E. You can also pronounce it forte. Both pronunciations are acceptable. In fact, one of my favorite fight directors, Spencer Jackson Hole, here in Utah, calls it the forte. But this is the strong part of the blade. It's also the defensive part of the blade. And if you are parrying an attack, the fort here is going to give you the most leverage and the most strength and allow you to maneuver and move that blade around. If you need to move it into another position to open a line of attack, you're going to want to make sure that the tip of their blade, their foible, is against your fort. Not only that, but this is what is going to tell the story to the audience the best. Stage combat is all about telling stories to the audience and letting them understand what is happening in this fight, what's going on, what these characters want, and who is in control of the fight at every single moment. So, if two people attack each other, and the swords make contact here in the middle of the blades, that doesn't tell the story very well. Nobody knows who's attacking, who's defending. If, however, one person's foible makes contact with another person's fort, well, that tells a pretty clear story that this person right here is attacking, this person right here is defending. So we want to tell those stories, and therefore, whenever you make contact with your opponent's blade, chances are you're going to want the foible of the attacker's blade making contact with the fort of the defender's blade. Now, the middle part of the blade, this is just called the middle or the midsection, and it really doesn't do anything other than give the weapon length and help deliver the foible to your opponent. So we are rarely going to be making contact right here. And if you look at a weapon and see there's a bunch of little grooves or bumps there in the middle, chances are most of those are mistakes from when someone parried a weapon incorrectly onto the middle of the blade. Okay, now, let's take a look at this weapon. This weapon right here has a swept guard, and therefore it is not symmetrical in this regard, okay? This side right here is different than this side. And this knuckle guard right here happens to line up with one of the edges of the weapon, and the other edge is on the back. So we're going to say that these weapons have two flat sides and two edges. And in fact, you can see it a little bit better with my rapier. So I'm going to switch over and show you my rapier. Here, clearly, you can see that this blade has two flat sides and then two edges. And one of those edges is in line with the knuckle guard. This is called a knuckle bow. And the other edge is in line with the other side of the sword. Okay? Now, the edge that is in line with the knuckle guard, we're going to call that the true edge of the blade. And everything that we do, well, 90% of what we do, is going to be done with the true edge of the blade. So if I want to attack somebody, I want to attack in such a way that it is the true edge of the blade that is going to be making contact with the thing that I'm attacking, or my partner or my target. I do not want to slap the flat of the blade against my partner. It doesn't tell the story. It doesn't make it look like I'm actually trying to attack. And not only that, but if I'm parried, then they're going to be parrying me on the flat of the blade. And that causes the sword to vibrate and shake, and it's not good for the sword. We want the sword to make contact with the edge of the blade, so there's no vibration, and it's edge-to-edge combat. It's safer, it's more appropriate for the blade, and it tells the story as well, that I'm actually trying to cut instead of slap or spank with the flat of the blade. I mean, if you want to do a joke, like at the end of a fight, I've disarmed my opponent, and then I smack them on the butt with the flat of my blade, okay, well, I'll accept that. But if you're actually trying to perform a fight where you are trying to injure or disarm or defend yourself, you're going to be using the true edge of the blade. The other edge is called the false edge of the blade, and we will use it occasionally, but not very much. We use it more in our next weapon, which is French smallsword. We'll be using these same weapons as practice, and for that, we will be doing a lot of stuff with the false edge of the blade. Okay, so now let's talk about how to hold these weapons. If you have one of these single swords, you'll notice that there's this little flat shelf right here along the back of the handle, and that is for your thumb to rest on. So your thumb just presses right up against that, and it's pointing up. The thumb is in line with the false edge of the blade. It's kind of like you're pressing your thumb right on a fingerprint reader on your thumb. You can think of it that way. Now your index finger just wraps around the other side, and the sword is actually pinched between those two fingers, right like that. Okay? The other three fingers just gently wrap around the rest of the handle, but do not really squeeze onto the sword. Really, the only thing that I'm squeezing with are the thumb and the index finger. The other three fingers are nice and loose. Now, what the other three fingers can be used for is to flick the weapon, like this, by opening and closing the grip. And that's a really common movement that we'll be doing a lot. But I want to make sure that when you're holding the weapon, that thumb is the most important thing, that it is in line with the false edge of the blade. You're not wrapping your thumb around it like this and holding it like a club with a clenched fist. We're not doing that. We've got that thumb in line with the false edge and the index finger wrapped around, pinching the blade. Now, a common phrase that you'll hear said by swords people is that you want to hold your weapon as if you were holding a bird. You don't want to squeeze so hard you crush it to death, but you also don't want to hold it so loosely that it flies away. You want to hold it with a nice medium grip, okay? Tight enough to hold on to it without killing it if it was a small bird in your hand. Okay, so that's how you hold a single sword. Now, if you get a chance to use one of our rapiers for assessment, they are held a little bit differently. That's because the rapier actually has a few extra parts to its anatomy. So first off, it does not have this big swept hilt. It does have a knuckle bow, but it's also got these things that are coming out here that make up what's called the crossguard. These are called the queons, and the two queons make up the crossguard. And the fact that a sword with a crossguard resembles the Christian crucifix is not an accident. That was an intentional choice by medieval swordspeople because religion, particularly Christianity, was often tied up in warfare, particularly wars and fighting and combat that would use swords like this. Okay, now, we also have this extra section of the blade right here. And this is a nice, thick, flat section. It does not have edges to it. That's called the ricasso. And the ricasso is surrounded by these little rings called the pedons. And there's even an extra ring right here. This is the ring Garde, and that is used to protect the back of the hand and the knuckles. So the way that we hold this weapon is actually on the ricasso. So we take our hand and we pinch the ricasso between our thumb and the index finger right there, and then wrap the other three fingers around the handle underneath the crossguard like this. And you can even extend your index finger along the ricasso if you want. And so I'm pinching it like that, and that's how we hold a rapier. We do not hold it like a handgun with a finger on the trigger. We don't do that. We don't have the thumb down here. The thumb and the index finger pinch the ricasso, and the other three fingers wrap gently there, and that way you can still do the same flicking motion with those three fingers opening and closing. Okay? So that's how you hold these two swords. Now, I'm going to be using the rapiers primarily so that you can see the blade. It's a little bit easier to see the flats of the blade and the edges of the blade when I do this. But everything that I'm doing can easily be done with a single sword. Okay, so that's enough talking about the actual sword itself. So now let's talk about an en garde position and your fighting stance. There are three main keys to our en garde position. The first key is that it is going to be a three-dimensional stance. Now, what do I mean by that? If I stand just like this, my body is basically taking up a two-dimensional frame. Okay? I'm making my body as flat as I possibly can. And I am going to say that this two-dimensional plane is giving my body width. Okay? It is horizontal thickness here. My body is nice and wide, but it doesn't have any depth. Now, competitive fencers in modern sport fencing, they do the opposite. They try to make their body as deep as possible and as thin and narrow as possible. So they also do their best to stay in a two-dimensional plane like this, where they're flattening their body out. And the reason they do that is because they want to minimize the target area that their opponent is able to touch with their blades. And that's why fencing blades are curved, so that as the sword passes the body, you're able to catch the body and snag it a little bit. And they only need to just touch their partner. They're not trying to stab or kill or wound or injure. They just need to touch their opponent. And therefore, if I can minimize the amount of places on my body that my opponent can touch, that gives me an advantage. However, historically, fighting like this is not necessarily a great idea. Because while I am minimizing the target area, the parts of my body that are open to being attacked are actually very vulnerable parts. Specifically, right here underneath my arm. I don't have any hard bones protecting right here. There's not a lot of muscle underneath my arm protecting. And therefore, if somebody was to stick a sword right into here, that sword would go right into my lungs, and that would be very, very bad for me. So it's actually safer, historically speaking, to point your chest towards your partner. And then, while I do have more surface area to show my partner where they can injure me, it's going to be more protected. I've got a lot of muscle and a lot of bone here in my chest that's going to help protect my vital organs inside. And the other thing that this does for us is it also helps tell the story to the audience. If I make my body look like this, my entire body is pointing that direction, even though my partner is over here. I want to tell the story for the audience that I am fighting this person. That my entire attention and everything about my body says that I am engaged in a struggle with this person right here. Therefore, my eyes need to be pointed towards this person. My shoulders need to be pointed towards the person. My hips need to be pointed towards the person. My front knee, my front toe, everything is pointed towards my partner, and I'm going to call that on line. So we've got two things so far about our stance. The first stance is that it's three-dimensional. It has both width and it has depth. And the other important thing is that my entire body is on line. Now let's specifically talk about the feet for just a moment. If you look down at your feet, they should be on opposite corners of a rectangle. So you do not want to end up getting rid of all of your width, where your heels are in a straight line. And you also don't want to get rid of all of your depth, where your feet are just wide apart like this, but in a single plane. They need to be in a three-dimensional shape. Now, if you have a choice for this weapon is deeper than it is wide. So your stance should be slightly longer in terms of depth than it is width. However, there is always going to be width. Do not let your feet end up here with your heels in line. Now, if you're having trouble with this, it can be useful to try standing in this fighting stance on a hard wood floor where the woods are in slats. And you can line up one foot on one slat, and you can line up the other foot on a slat several slats away. There should probably be about 4 or 5 slats of wood in between your feet. And that can give you a sense for how much depth you have in between your feet. Okay, now the other thing about your feet, I've already mentioned that my front foot should be pointed forward towards my partner, but it would be very uncomfortable for my back foot to also be pointed towards my partner. This is not an effective and comfortable way of standing. So I will allow you to turn your foot slightly so that it is at a 45-degree angle, but do not allow it to go to a 90-degree angle. So you can see right here, my feet are making up a 90-degree or a right angle. And when I do that, I can't help but point my hips offline. If I want to point my hips online, it's very uncomfortable unless I move that foot to a 45-degree angle. Now I can point my hips towards my partner very comfortably. So, front foot pointed forward towards our partner, back foot at a 45-degree angle. You have both width and depth, slightly more depth than width. Those are the first two things, three-dimensional stance and on line. Third thing is that we're going to lower the center of gravity and sink down into your fighting stance. It's very, very low, which means you need to bend your knees. Now this can be a little painful after a while if you're not used to standing like this. It takes a little bit of time to build up the muscles and the endurance for standing in a fighting position. When I was studying competitive fencing in high school, my coach would tell us that it would be useful to just stand in front of a television watching TV in this position for a while, with our knees bent, sinking down to the ground to develop those muscles. And that's really not a bad idea. But at the very least, whenever you're performing these exercises, sink down. Keep your center of gravity lowered, bend those knees, and you will eventually build up some more resistance and endurance in these quadriceps. Okay, so this is the way that my feet are. Now my hips are underneath my shoulders. I am not poking my butt out. I'm not standing like this. My upper body is very relaxed and upright. My hips are underneath my shoulders are above my hips, and my center of gravity is balanced in the center between these 2 feet. Okay? Here we are. Now, hands. If you were watching competitive fencers, you'll often see them with their hand here, or their hand here, or up here is really the appropriate place for them to put it. And if you're watching swashbuckling movies, you might see people fighting with one hand behind their back, or a hand up here jauntily raised. What I want to see you do is I want to see this hand active. So your sword should be out in front of you, and this other hand should be out in front of you. Just because you don't have a weapon in it doesn't mean it can't be used to bat aside a blade, to grab the handle of your opponent, to punch, or to grapple with it. It's useful. It's a weapon. So keep it out here in front and allow it to be active. The sword is also just going to float out in front of here. Now, with the single rapier spanned a very long amount of time in history. And when people started using rapiers, there wasn't yet a system of codified parries and guards. So there wasn't necessarily guard 3, guard 4, guard 6, guard 8, like we're going to get to in French smallsword. Instead, a guard was just a place from which you could start an attack. So they can be almost anything. You can have a guard up here. You can have a guard here, a guard here, guard here. You can even have a guard here. Any place where you could launch an attack from is a guard. Okay, so we just for now want the sword floating out in front of us. Now the big #1 safety rule is never ever ever threaten your partner's face with your weapon. So you can put the tip of the blade pretty much anywhere you want for now, as long as it is not in front of your partner's face. So you can have it above your partner's face, you can have it below your partner's face, but do not put it in front. And if you go from high to low, go around the face, do not go through the face. Okay, so here is my en garde position. Now what I want you to film yourself doing is I want you to film yourself in an en garde position doing some weight shifts. Weight shifts are one of the most important tools that we have for storytelling because it helps the actors sync up and tell the story together of what's happening in the fight. If I am weight shifted forward, I am invading my partner's space and I am making aggressive movements. If I am weight shifted back, my partner is invading my space and I am making defensive movements, and I may even be inviting them to come into my space so that I can get them to overcommit to an attack which I successfully defend, and then I can return an attack of my own. Now, as you weight shift, you need to stay low and you need to stay centered. You're going to weight shift forward towards your partner, and you're going to weight shift back away from your partner. You are not going to go side to side. This is a lot easier, but that is not what we are doing. We're not going side to side. We're going forward and we are going backwards. And really see how far you can stretch forward and see how far you can go back. I don't want to see you moving like this as if you are in a Mortal Kombat video game. I want to see you really extending and compressing. And as you do that, your head stays low. You can imagine that your head is on a rail. There's a big metal pole going through the back of your head, out the front of your head, and your head is sliding along that pole, leaving a trail of braids and blood and guts on its path. But we're just sliding along that pole towards our partner and away from our partner. And our partner, if they were with us, their head would also be on that same pole, moving at the same level forward and backward together. Our feet would also be lined up with our right foot in line with their left foot and our left foot in line with their right foot, as if we were standing on railroad tracks together. And I should also mention that generally speaking, the same foot is going to be forward with you and your partner. Now, it doesn't matter which foot it is. You can put your left foot forward, or you can put your right foot forward. Both of these are totally acceptable. But usually, your partner's going to have the same foot forward, and that way the 2 feet fit together like puzzle pieces. And we're going to call that puzzle piece position. Now, if your partner has a different foot forward, that means you're going to be in a mirrored position where you have the same foot on the same side together. And that means your knees might knock together. There's less space to move your sword in between without whacking somebody's knees. That's not the standard place to be. Usually we're going to be in puzzle piece. So this right here is standard en garde position. Left foot forward is fine, right foot forward is fine. It's up to you what you want to do, but I want to see you videotape yourself weight shifting forward and back. And now I'll show it to you from a different angle, going forward and weight shifting back. And I want to see the front foot totally straight when you're weight shifted back, and I want to see the back leg totally straight as you're weight shifted forward. Notice that my foot stays flat on the ground. I'm not lifting up my heel. If I do that, then I am going to fall forward and I'll lose my balance. So keep that heel touching the ground and you're pushing off the heel. Same thing as you weight shift back. Don't lift that toe up. Keep that toe flat on the ground. And your eyes are on your partner and you're just weight shifting forward and back. Nice and slow. Really extend, relaxing the upper body. All right? Well, that is it for this first video. This was a long one because we were talking so much about the sword and about the position. The remaining videos are going to be nice and short. I should say one last thing. You are welcome to use these weapons in either hand. Totally acceptable. If you're left-handed, use the sword in your left hand. If you're right-handed, use it in your right hand. The swords themselves are specific to hands. Mine right here, these are both right-handed weapons. Just because of the shape of the guard, you can see there's a little bit more space on this side than there is on this side. And this one right here has this knuckle bow, this ring guard, and the knuckle bow, and together they indicate that this can really only be held appropriately by a right-handed person. But we have left-handed swords. They're the ones with the white tape on the handle. And if you need to use a left-handed sword in your left hand, that's fine. If you need to use a right-handed sword in your left hand or a left-handed sword in your right hand, that's fine too. It's not going to be the end of the world. In future videos, I am going to be referring, though, to your dominant hand. And I will most likely be demonstrating it with my right hand. I may shift to left hand occasionally, but I'm going to be using the terms dominant and non-dominant hand to refer to your sword hand and your active hand without a weapon. All right, thank you so much. Let's move on to the next video.